Hello. I'm going to talk to you about analysing data, which is the last stage of working on your research project before you plan how you're going to present it. I've said a lot more about data analysis in the textbook than I'll be able to say in this short lecture, so I would advise you to have a look at the units that deal with data analysis. It's quite a tricky thing to do. When you've collected lots of data enthusiastically, it can then be quite daunting to decide what you're going to do about it, but I'm going to try and explain a few guidelines here for things to think about. So one of these is to refer back to your research questions. What were you trying to find out? Because as you do your analysis, you should be answering those questions based on the data that you've collected. If you were collecting material that counts as quantitative, that is to do with numbers and figures, then that's the way you'll approach analysis. And if you were taking a more qualitative approach, then obviously that will guide you in a slightly different direction. I'll try and explain a bit more about what I mean. If your questions are things like how often does something happen, or how many instances of something do you find, or if you've got a question of the to what extent kind, or do speakers use a feature more if they belong to one category than another category, then you're probably taking a quantitative sort of approach, and in that case you need to do some measuring, some counting and some calculating. Arts and humanities students often get scared at this point and think, oh, I came here to do an English degree, not a mathematics degree, I don't know how to deal with numbers. But you do really, and if you don't, you can learn a bit more about it, so don't be scared. You wouldn't have got here if you hadn't got Maths GCSE, and there might be people in your group who do know some statistics and understand a bit more about this than you do, so you can learn from them, and now it's a good time to do so. When you're doing counting and comparing, you've got to be aware of what exactly it is that you are counting and whether you're comparing like with like. Don't be tempted to push things in one direction or the other because that's what you expected to find out. And you should at least, even if you don't do complicated statistical procedures on your data, you should at least know the difference between raw figures and percentages. And there's an example of this in the textbook, which is adapted from something that Dick Hudson, a linguist in London, put online on his homepage, and I've checked recently, it is still there. He takes as an example a sociolinguistic variable, what in RP is pronounced as T, and looks at the different ways that people might pronounce this depending on their accent. One way is with a glottal stop, one way is not to pronounce it at all, and the sort of default variable is variant is taken to be the T variable. So he gives an example of some speakers. Imagine that you've interviewed 4 different people and you've asked them to talk about a similar thing, and they've responded spontaneously, and as they've done this, they've used words with the T sound in them, and speaker A has produced 13 of these and 28 glottal stops, and in 11 contexts where they might have used a T sound, they haven't used one at all. And this speaker has used T 53 times and hasn't used the glottal stop or the absent sound at all. And that gives you a range of figures, 52, 63, 54 and so on. If you convert those to percentages, you get a much clearer impression of the usage of these different speakers. So you can see that this one always uses the RP variant, whereas this one nearly always uses the glottal stop variant. We've taken out the 0 variant just to make it clearer. So if you're going to compare things, remember that on the previous example you've actually got different numbers of totals here. So speaker A has got 52 opportunities to use the sound in the speech that they've generated for you, and speaker B has had 63 opportunities. So to say that there are 28 of these and 15 of these isn't as clear when you think that that's out of 52 and that's out of 63 as when you see it as percentages. So that's one thing to think about when you're doing calculations and comparisons and counting things up. You're using quantitative claims when you say things happen mostly in these contexts, or the speakers often do this, or women never say that, or so on. So if you make claims like that, it's good if you can back them up with some actual statistics and figures from your data. The other way to approach analysing some language is from a qualitative point of view, and if you've asked questions like, how do speakers and texts speak in this context, or present themselves as online dating advertisers, or whatever it is, or how has this kind of language changed over time, or an in what ways question, or what are the features of this kind of text or talk, then you're not asking how often and how many and how much, you're asking what is this thing like, or what are these kinds of texts or talk like. And that's a qualitative kind of question, and so once you've got your data, you've got to decide how to come up with some findings about it using a more qualitative approach to analysis. So the sorts of things you'll do is identify the characteristics of the data that you've collected using categories, grouping things together. So you might code your data, you might take all your texts and then look for modal verbs, for example, or positively evaluative adjectives, look for interruptions in spoken data. So that where you've got individual words in the initial data, you then have words grouped together because they have something in common, or stretches of interaction grouped together to say, well, this is this kind of thing that's going on here. And having done that, you might, as I'm explaining a bit, want to say, are there patterns in how often these things happen? But first of all, you're looking for the patterns themselves. One of the advantages of working as a team at this stage of the module is that you can share the work. Different people can look for different things, so you might have the same transcripts with several people working on the same one, but some people looking for interruptions, other people looking for tag questions, other people looking for hedges, other people for looking for different sorts of adjectives, and so on. So you build up an overall picture, but with different people focusing on different parts of the work. The other advantage is that you can use what we call inter-rater reliability. You can see whether the same patterns are identified by two different people checking. So you could each take a small stretch of your data, a small extract, and say, right, we'll both of us will code it using these codes. I'm going to look for the modals, you look for the modals, and we'll see at the end whether we've agreed that the same things count as modals or as interruptions or as adjectives of this kind or whatever it is. And then if you find there are differences, you have to discuss, well, why did you classify that way? I didn't think that was one of those. And then you can jot down in your notes what is to count as one of these or one of those, and improve your coding procedure between you. But having done that, it might mean, as I say, that you realise that these patterns are actually quantitative as well. So although you've started off by talking about the characteristics of the text, you then say, well, actually what we're noticing is that there are a lot more of those than there are of these, and then you might need to do some quantitative comparisons. Likewise, if you've started off with a quantitative approach, you might realise that there is still some room for negotiation about what is to count as one of these or one of those, and then you're looking more qualitatively at your data. So you don't have to be doing just one or the other, and think about how you can best answer the questions that you've set yourselves. And having looked at your analysis of the data, it takes you towards presenting your findings, because you might now have graphs, tables, pie charts, coding images to put into your presentation. Think about what you've definitely found out and what you can say, in our data we definitely have these findings, and what that you may have found interesting but not necessarily conclusive. So that you would realise that you need to do some more work to find out whether this is a general trend or whether it just happens in the particular data that you've got, and so on. Do think about how to convey the information clearly. The tables I've just shown you from Dick Hudson's example I think are fairly clear, and are much clearer than if you just describe that certain people use the glottal stop, other people at other times use the t variant. You know, putting it into a table can save you a lot of words, and that becomes relevant when you're writing up your research in the second project for the second half of the module. So that's the content of the presentation, in a sense, ways of thinking about what to include in it in relation to your findings and your data analysis. But there's a lot on the wiki about preparing for doing the presentations, and there'll be more information available about this soon. So I hope that's useful to give you an idea about ways of going about data analysis. Remember that you can come back and look at this lecture, and indeed any of the others, at any point, and you might want to go back now and look at some of the earlier lectures, and go back in the reading and look at some of the material that you've already seen, simply to refresh your memory and put the whole thing into context as you get towards the end of the project, where you've read, thought about, identified clearly questions about your topic, collected your data, and now you're at the stage of putting it all together. So I'm looking forward to seeing how these presentations will explain what you've been doing, and do get in touch with me if you have any questions.